All right, so chapter 6 is about adolescence. When we think about adolescent physical growth, adolescents undergo a growth spurt that produces dramatic changes in height. Girls typically start their growth spurt about 2 years before boys. Puberty usually occurs during that marks the beginning of adolescence, and that's when the pituitary gland will send signals to other glands to begin producing the sex hormones. Androgens are the male hormones, and estrogens are the female hormones. Leptin also plays a role in the onset of puberty. In recent years, though, puberty has started to begin a lot earlier in girls at 11 or 12. And I even read an article recently that said it starts as early as 9 years old. And for boys, it typically doesn't start till about 13 or 14. There are a number of environmental factors that could contribute to the onset of puberty for girls, which is known as menarche. That's when they begin their period or menstruation. It can vary in different parts of the world, but more affluent and better nourished and healthier girls tend to start earlier. Obesity can also lead to early maturity when the proportion of fat to muscle plays a role in the timing of the menstruation. Environmental stressors can also play a role in early menarche. And since the 19th century, US girls have been experiencing menarche earlier than other parts of the world. An earlier start to menstruation is an example of a secular trend. Those statistical tendencies are observed over several generations. The primary sex characteristics occur when the development of organs and structures related to reproduction begin. That's when females undergo changes in their vagina and uterus. Secondary sex characteristics are the development of visible signs of sexual maturity, such as breast and pubic hair. Changes in hormones during puberty may lead to depression and feelings of anger, and it's debated about what contributes to the exceptionality of early puberty. For boys, the growth of the penis and scrotum occur around age 12 and goes on for about 4 years. Spermark usually occurs around the age of 13 when the boy has his first ejaculation. Secondary sex characteristics, such as deepening of a voice, are followed by primary sex characteristic changes, and the hormones tend to fluctuate, which can lead to some anger and annoyance. When it comes to adolescent body image can be based on reactions to physical changes. Boys experience that first ejaculation and they rarely discuss it. And girls who experience puberty usually have higher self esteem, a rise in status and self awareness when they begin menstruation. Girls are often also unhappy with their developing bodies because of societal pressures and may start to shrink inside of themselves. When it comes to early maturation, it generally is associated with positive effects for boys because they're better at athletics, more popular, they have a positive self esteem, they tend to be more cooperative and responsible, but they may be likely to engage in delinquency, drug use, and have other problems in school as well. Girls, though, are sometimes uncomfortable with their bodily changes and um, their reaction to experiencing puberty is going to also depend on cultural norms. Many girls tend to be more popular, although they're not really ready to deal with dating at that time. When children experience late maturation, it can be very difficult for boys because they're smaller and therefore seen as less attractive and poorer at sports. Their dating lives, as a result, suffer, and that can lead to a decline in self concept and how they view themselves. But coping with these challenges may help them become more assertive, insightful, and more creative. Girls, on the other hand, when they are late matures, they tend to be overlooked and have low social status. And when they catch up, their self esteem is generally high because they're slender, leggy, and society tends to think positively about that. So when it comes to the adolescent growth spurt, it requires an increase in food of calcium and iron So girls at this time will need about 2,200 calories a day, and boys at this age will need about 2,800 calories a day. Even though there's a need for increased calories during adolescence, obesity is also a concern. 1 in 5 adolescents are overweight, and 1 in 20 are obese. There can be some psychological consequences to their um, that are severe because of their body focus. There are also some potential health consequences. Obese adolescents have about 80% chance of being obese in adulthood because that tends to, kind of stay the course. And a lack of exercise, a sedentary lifestyle, and the availability of fast food are all contributing factors that can impact whether or not someone develops obesity. There can also be various eating disorders that occur as a result of these body image issues that happen during adolescence. So we have anorexia nervosa, which is a severe eating disorder where a person refuses to eat and they deny that their behavior or appearance is happening. 15 to 20% of people with anorexia starve themselves to death. This primarily affects women between ages of 12 and 40. They're often intelligent, successful, attractive, and affluent, but there are also about 10% of males who experience anorexia. Bulimia nervosa is characterized by binging and purging. So, binging large amounts of food, eating lots of really high calorie foods, and then purging through the use of laxatives or vomiting. This can create a lot of health issues such as chemical imbalances due to chronic vomiting and diarrhea. Can also cause heart failure, tooth decay. Eating disorders are biological and environmental, so they can require multiple treatment approaches. When it comes to the adolescent brain, this is a time when neurons continue to grow. They become richer, they become more complex, and pruning also occurs. So if there are any neurons that are not really being used, they are done away with, and there's about 1 to 2% of those that are pruned each year. Myelination increases, and that is the process of insulating those nerve cells with fat cells so that those neural impulses can occur more frequently or quicker. Adolescent thinking also becomes much more sophisticated. The prefrontal cortex is not fully developed during adolescence and doesn't fully develop until the early 20s. And that part of the brain is responsible for complex intellectual achievements. And it also helps us engage in emotional expression and impulse control. So, because that part of the brain is immature in adolescence, it can explain some of their risky and impulsive behavior. It can also explain why they tend to overestimate the risk and overestimate rewards and underestimate the risk of engaging in certain behaviors. Deprivation is another concern during adolescence because there's a shift in the body's internal clock that causes them to want to sleep later. But then the school system requires that they wake up early. So sleepy teens tend to have lower grades, more depression, and can be prone to mood swings. So here are some factors we want to review regarding physical maturation of adolescents. And let's go ahead and have our first question. Which of the following is an example of a primary sex characteristic? And the correct answer is going to be C, changes in the uterus. Here's another question. The most common nutritional concern in adolescence is, hopefully you said D, obesity. Now let's talk about some threats that occur that could be harmful to adolescents. Illegal drugs. So 1 in 15 high school seniors use marijuana daily. Adolescents use drugs to seek pleasure, escape pressure, and to fit in with others. They might also use stimulants to improve their academic performance. Adderall is an amphetamine that's typically prescribed for ADHD but can be abused. When used illegally, it's consumed and assumed to increase focus and the ability to study. Addictive drugs can produce biological and psychological consequences and dependence. Adolescents who use these drugs to escape never really learn how to problem solve. And because they never learn how to problem solve, it continues to be a problem throughout their life. Casual users can escalate their use to more dangerous drugs. Alcohol can also become a problem during adolescence, with more than 62% of college students consuming alcohol in the last 30 days. One third of them will say that they've had 5 or more drinks in the past 2 weeks. More than 60% of high school seniors have drank alcohol, and 42% of eighth graders have had alcohol. Binge drinking occurs when a person consumes 5 or more drinks for men or 4 or more drinks for women in more than one setting. About 40% of males and 35% of females report that they engage in binge drinking in the past 2 weeks. And this can lead to drinks harassing others. It can lead those who drink to harass others, and brain scans also show us that there's damage to the brain when individuals binge drink alcohol. Research has found that adolescents primarily drink to relieve stress and tension, to show prowess athletically, because of the false consensus effect, the belief that everybody does it. And some adolescents become alcoholics. And those are generally the ones who are genetically prone to become alcoholic, and also the ones who use alcoholism as a way to deal with stress, and it's used as a negative coping strategy. Here are some signs that adolescents are abusing alcohol or drugs: identification with the drug culture, physical deterioration, dramatic changes in school performance, and changes in behavior. Tobacco use can also pose a threat to adolescents. Smoking is more prevalent among girls, and a significant number of adolescents smoke, but overall, those numbers are decreasing. White children and those from low SES tend to smoke more than African American children and those of high SES. Smoking also just tends to be a rite of passage. Influential models in their life might smoke. Cigarettes can be addictive. And because of those things, nicotine can produce biological and psychological dependence. People who smoke as few as 10 cigarettes early in their lives stand an 80% chance of becoming habitual smokers. Another problem that can occur during adolescence is a sexually transmitted infection, or an STI. 1 in 4 adolescents tend to contract an STI before they graduate high school, and that includes any of the infections you see there: HPV, trichomoniasis, chlamydia, genital herpes, gonorrhea, and syphilis, and AIDS. AIDS is by far the sexual transmitted infection that is the most debilitating. African Americans and Hispanics account for 70% of new AIDS cases. African American males have almost 8 times the prevalence of AIDS as Caucasian males. More than 35 million people have died from AIDS worldwide, and another 36 million are living with the disease. Ways to avoid an STI is to practice abstinence. Don't engage in sexual contact. To know your sex partner well, meaning you know their status in terms of having STIs and they know yours. Use condoms. They protect not only from pregnancy, but from having from a disease. Avoid the exchange of bodily fluids, particularly semen. That includes oral sex. Stay sober. Sometimes when people drink alcohol, they make do drugs, they make bad decisions. And consider monogamy, only being with one person. Here are some review items for us to consider regarding threats to well-being. And let's take a look at a review question. Adolescents may grow to depend on drugs to cope with the stressors they encounter every day. This is known as what? And hopefully you said C, compensatory drug use. Blank is the most common sexually transmitted infection. And the answer is HPV, which is why many children get vaccines for that now. Now let's discuss the cognitive development of adolescence. According to Piaget, adolescence is a time of formal operational thoughts. So this is when people begin to think abstractly, when their full capabilities of using the principles of logic unfold, and that occurs usually between 12 and 15 years of age. Adolescents at this time can also engage in propositional thought, where they use abstract thought in the absence of concrete examples. About 25 to 60% of college students never develop formal operations, and cultural values can also influence the achievement of formal operational thought. By engaging in formal operational thought, teenagers can change their behavior due to their abstract thinking. They may become more argumentative, and they can also become more interesting but challenging. Many people criticize Piaget's approach because they don't believe that cognitive abilities are occur in steps, that his research is not universal. They think that he underestimated the skills of infants and young children. And they also believe that more sophisticated forms of thinking do not develop into early adulthood, which they call post-formal thinking. The informational processing approach looks at cognitive development as a gradual transformation in how information is used. According to this approach, adolescents organize their thinking and develop new strategies. Metacognition, or thinking about your thinking, becomes much more important because adolescents can then gauge what they know and don't understand about something when they need to study or get help from others, and it can help them make a better judge or be a better judge of their own learning. Egocentrism is also a major factor in adolescent thought processes because adolescents tend to focus on themselves, and they do engage in egocentrism. They're highly critical of authority figures. They often avoid criticizing themselves but find fault in other people. It can lead to two distortions: an imaginary audience, where the focus of everyone's attention is on them in their head, and personal fables, where they believe that what happens to them is unique and nobody else understands. Here are some review items for adolescent cognitive development. And here is a question. 15-year-old Wyatt is able to solve the physics problem from class in abstract rather than in concrete terms. According to Piaget, Wyatt is now capable of what? And hopefully you view the answer as B, formal operational thought. Here's another question. Blank is the knowledge that people have about their own thinking processes and their ability to monitor their cognition. And hopefully you chose the answer A, metacognition. Now let's talk about adolescent school performance. Over the years, the grades of high schoolers have risen, but independent measures of achievement have not risen. So researchers believe that the rise of grades is not due to intelligence, but to grade inflation. Students in the United States tend to score lower than other industrialized nations on formal tests such as the SAT and the ACT test. They spend less class time, less intensive instruction, and have more diverse populations as well. Graduation rates have also dropped, with only 79% of U.S. children graduating. We know that there's a strong relationship between achievement and SES, with children from poorer families or low socioeconomic statuses having fewer resources, lower health, more inadequate schools, and less involved parents. There are also some ethnic and racial differences in school achievement. The reason why these differences occur are unclear, but we know that African Americans and Hispanic families are more likely to live in poverty. African American and Hispanic students perform lower than Caucasians do, and Asians tend to perform the highest when it comes to school performance. So, if we take SES into account, achievement differences diminish. The cultural value of school success also impacts performance. When consequences for failure are high, then performance is going to improve. And attributions for school success can also impact performance. In the United States, dropouts earn 42% less than people who graduate from high school. Dropout unemployment rate is about 50%. Some people end up leaving high school or grade school because of pregnancy, problems with English, and economic reasons. Males are far more likely, however, than females to drop out of school. Students from lower income homes tend to drop out more. Perhaps they have to go work and help their family. And Asians tend to drop out the least, followed by Caucasians, Hispanics, and African Americans. When it comes to screen time or social media use, young people tend to spend about 6.5 hours a day on or using media. About 25% of that time, they're using more than one form of media. Perhaps they're watching TV and on Snapchat. They may actually be closer to 8.5 hours per day. Some teens send about 30,000 texts a month, and those texts supplant other forms of interaction. They'd rather text than to talk on the phone or see someone in person. Many online activities can be mean spirited during adolescence, and that is why cyberbullying has become such a big issue. That's the practice of sending victims texts or emails with hurtful comments. The source of cyberbullying can be anonymous, which can lead to particularly abusive messages. When using the web, students should learn to search, choose, and integrate information that they find. Although the web provides us with very, very valuable information, it can also have a downside because of the availability of objectionable material. The use of the web can creates challenges for those from lower socioeconomic status and people from different races and ethnicities, because many poor adolescents don't have access and can't um, do all of the things that their wealthier counterparts do, which creates a digital divide. So if we look at figure 6-8, we can see the difference between teens in 2012 and 2018. And we can see that in 2012, more students were engaging in person conversation than texting. Here's a review of adolescent school performance. And let's go ahead and have a practice question. Because of the unfavorable comparison of U.S. standardized test scores to the scores of other countries, the gradual shift upward of adolescent grades in the past decade has been attributed to what? And hopefully you said B, grade inflation. The unequal access that adolescents have to educational computers and technology depends on their socioeconomic status, race, and ethnicity, and has been termed what? And the correct answer is D, the digital divide. One of the main reasons or the main goals of adolescence is to develop an identity. A self concept broadens during adolescence to include self assessment and the assessment of others. It's how one views themselves, and it can become much more organized and coherent during adolescence because they view themselves in terms of traits and can see multiple aspects of themselves. Self esteem has to do with how they like themselves. And this is a measure of how much adolescents like aspects of themselves and if they criticize some aspects over others. When it comes to self esteem, girls tend to have a lower self esteem than boys. Girls' self esteem is usually complicated by societal perceptions. There are oftentimes stereotypes for boys that add pressure that they must be tough in all situations. There are also a bit of a race difference when it comes to self esteem. Those from higher socioeconomic status, race, and ethnicity also tends to impact self esteem. There's usually less biased treatment of minorities, and that has eased the impact of socioeconomic and racial differences in self esteem. African American adolescents have the same levels of self esteem as do Caucasians. African American and Hispanic males have the highest rates of self esteem than anyone, and Asian and Native American females tend to have the lowest levels of self esteem. According to Eric Erickson, identity versus identity confusion occurs during the adolescent time period. This is when adolescents try to find a suitable identity and they follow a dysfunctional path. So they fail and they um, have a sense of their sense of self fails to organize, or they find a suitable identity and it sets the foundation for their future psychosocial development. There can be some societal pressures and reliance on friends and peers that also impact performance, with a lot of social pressure to achieve secure identity. And adolescents rely more on their peers than do their parents and adults. And this can link and have a direct link to the next stage, according to Erickson, which is intimacy versus isolation. According to Erickson, adolescents can resolve their identity crisis through psychological moratorium. And that is because of pressures. Adolescents pursue a psychological moratorium, a period when they let go of responsibilities and explore new roles. People criticize Erickson's theory because they believe that his views are based on male oriented concepts. And Carol Gilligan suggests that women develop identity while developing relationships. In this view, caring networks are a part of a woman's identity. Marcia's approach updated some of Erickson's view of identity formation. Marcia said that identity is seen in terms of two characteristics: crisis, where they consciously choose between alternatives, and commitment, where there's a psychological investment in a course of action. According to Marcia, there are four categories of identity: identity achievement, identity foreclosure, moratorium, and identity diffusion. And this chart shows Marcia's four categories and based on examples that relate to each, from identity diffusion: I have no idea what I want to do; identity foreclosure: my dad says I'm good with kids, so I guess I'll be a teacher. And then identity moratorium is when I'm taking a job at my mom's bookstore until I figure out what I really want to do. And identity achievement, where they say, I enjoyed working at the advertising company, so I plan on going into advertising. When it comes to religion and spirituality and identity formations, teens think more abstractly about religious matters. They may question their religious identity, and their religion provides a view of the world having intentional designs. Jane Fowler says that there are different stages to identity formation. There's childhood, adolescence, young adult, and the conjunctive stage, where adolescents may work to promote common good and a unified view of people across the globe. When it comes to ethnicity and race regarding identity formation, there's a cultural assimilation model and there's a pluralistic society model, which says that racial and ethnic factors become central to one's identity. It can include development of racial and ethnic identities and a commitment that ties to the same group. Depression and suicide can become major psychological difficulties for adolescents. Adolescent depression happens in about 3% of adolescents. There can be biological, environmental, and social causes. Girls tend to have a high incidence of depression, with Black adolescents having a higher rate of depression than whites, and Native Americans having a higher rate of depression as well. Experiencing depression can be caused by losing someone, growing up with a depressed parent, not being popular, and being rejected by peers. Adolescent suicide rates tripled in the last 30 years. There's one teenage suicide every 90 minutes, with girls having more attempts at suicide, but boys being more likely to complete it. And the reason for the rise in suicide rates is unclear, but it can be because of depression, social inhibition, perfectionism, and stress, family conflicts, a history of abuse and neglect, drug and alcohol abuse, and suicide clusters, seeing somebody else do it. Warning signs can include direct or indirect talk about suicide, school difficulties, making arrangements such as giving away prized possessions, writing a will, losing appetite, experiencing general depression, changes in sleep patterns, a dramatic change in behavior, and preoccupation with death. If you or someone you know is contemplating suicide, you should talk to a person without judgment. Talk specifically about suicidal thoughts. Try to distinguish between upset and more serious dangers. Be supportive. Take charge of finding help. Make the environment safe. Do not keep suicidal thoughts or threats secret. Do not challenge, dare, or use verbal shock. Make a contract for the person to stay safe. Don't be reassured by a sudden improvement in behavior or feelings. And for immediate help, contact a suicide hotline such as 988. Here's a review of some of the issues related to adolescent identity. And let's go ahead and look at a question. Andrew plans to become a lawyer and is now studying hard to earn good grades so he can eventually enter law school. He has pursued this course largely because his father and mother are prominent lawyers, attorneys who always expected him to follow in their footsteps. According to James Marcia, Andrew is an excellent example of what place of identity. And just like the example, that would be identity foreclosure. Now let's talk a little bit about the relationships between adolescents and their family and friends. Adolescence is a time to seek out autonomy, to be able to do things on your own. So the parent and child relationship goes from being asymmetrical to a more balanced relationship. Degrees of autonomy are going to vary with family and cultural expectations. Westernized adolescents tend to seek autonomy a lot earlier than their European counterparts, and males are often permitted more autonomy than their female counterparts. Some people believe that there's a generation gap between older generations and the younger generations, but that's mostly a myth. There's most often a great love and respect that occurs between those from middle adulthood and adolescence. Adolescents can have conflict with their parents. They can become argumentative and much more assertive, and that can create problems. The conflict is generally resolved by the end of adolescence because those disagreements may involve differing definitions of appropriate and inappropriate conduct. And new reasoning abilities can lead teens to think about parental rules in more complex ways. There are also some cultural differences in parent-child conflicts. There's less conflict in traditional pre-industrial cultures. In industrialized societies, the emphasis is on individualism and independence. In traditional societies, they tend to value individualism less, which leads to less conflict. Social comparison occurs when peer relationships are more critical than any other time in life. Peers provide an opportunity for social comparison, and the reference group are groups that present a set of norms and standards against which adolescents judge their social success. And nowadays, that might be somebody online. Cliques and crowds provide a sense of belonging to adolescents. There's increased cognitive sophistication, which allows adolescents to group themselves with others in more discriminating ways. Adolescents are usually a part of an identifiable group. They have strong expectations for people in a crowd to behave a specific way. They typically form membership in groups where they are similar with others. And these groups usually require teens to make judgments of people whom they have little interaction with or direct knowledge of. Gender relations tend to change during adolescence. Some adolescents become rejected and others become popular. Peer pressure can play a big role in adolescent development because peers tend to conform to their behavior and attitudes to others they are around. Being susceptible to peer pressure doesn't rise in adolescence. Conformity also decreases as adolescents tend to establish more autonomy. Some adolescents end up being involved in juvenile delinquency, and these are usually teens who are relatively aggressive in early life. Maybe they're rejected by their peers. They could have ADHD. They could be less intelligent, and they could struggle to be rehabilitated and therefore have a life of crime. Many crimes of adolescence are usually influenced by a group, maybe a gang or something like that, and most of their crimes are usually committed in groups. Many patterns of segregation continue to appear in schools. Minority students seek support from others to affirm their identity, which is a crucial developmental process for adolescents. In schools with rigid tracking systems, minority students may find themselves in classes with proportionally more or even fewer minorities, and that practice may inadvertently maintain and promote racial and ethnic segregation. Here are some review concepts for us to consider, and a few others. And here's a question. The people with whom adolescents compare themselves are known as, hopefully you said D, reference groups. Now let's talk a bit about dating, sexual behavior, and teenage pregnancy. Dating is a way to learn how to establish intimacy, entertainment, and develop identity. Most dating occurs in early adolescence and it's superficial. It's not really based on anything. True intimacy is more common in late adolescence. And for adolescents who identify themselves as LGBTQ, dating is usually challenged by homophobic prejudice, and they find their partners oftentimes um, unwilling, or whether or not they are willing partners will be based on how openly they express their sexual orientation. Culture can influence dating patterns for adolescents. This is especially true if the concept of dating is unfamiliar to parents. Asian parents may hold particularly conservative attitudes regarding dating because they may have been in arranged marriages or never dated themselves. Masturbation can also become a big deal for adolescents because it's initiation into sexuality. It's widespread but can still cause feelings of shame. In today's society, it's mostly viewed as normal, healthy, and harmless. Sexual intercourse is also something that occurs during adolescence, and the ages of first intercourse are declining. 1 in 5 adolescents have had sex before 15. Around 3/4 have had sex before 20. But many teens are postponing sexual activity. When it comes to those who are LGBTQ, It's difficult to determine the exact proportions of homosexuality that exist in adolescent society, as it's seen on a continuum. Most people will agree that 4 to 10% of men and women are exclusively homosexual during extended periods. Sexual orientation and gender identity are not necessarily related. Transgender individuals oftentimes feel trapped in their body or other genders of the other gender. And intersex individuals are born with atypical combinations of sex organs or chromosomal patterns. What causes sexual orientation is not easily understood. There could be biological, environmental, and genetic factors that play a role. Psychological family dynamic theories are not supported by research. Many adolescents with LGBTQ sexual orientation and identities can be likely to be depressed, easily victimized. They can have lower rates of adjustment, and society's attitudes about this group of people are changing and becoming more accepting. Teenage pregnancy can become another difficulty during adolescence, and it's decreased significantly over the last 2 decades. In 2014, the birth rate for U.S. teenagers was lowest in the 7 decades of record keeping. Pregnancy rates are 20.3 births per 1,000 teens, and factors that have influenced that are new initiatives to raise awareness about unprotected sex, rates of intercourse between teens dropping, use of contraceptives have increased, and substitutes for sexual intercourse are more prevalent. Virginity pledges have been found to not be helpful. Unintended pregnancy can be devastating to both the mother and the child. Mothers often drop out and are tied to low paying jobs and welfare, which begins a cycle of poverty. And mothers' physical and mental health can suffer from the stress and demands that they have on their time. Here is a review of dating, sexual behavior, and teen pregnancy. And let's look at a question. Which of the following is not typically a function of dating in the early adolescent years? And hopefully you chose A, selecting a marriage partner. And another question, people who feel they are trapped in the body of a person of another gender are often referred to as what? And hopefully you said C, transgender. I hope this has provided more understanding for you for Chapter 6, Adolescence.